No. No. We have a problem in this country. Well, we have a lot of problems in this country, but there's only so much time in the day and only so many topics I can cover. And the specific thing that I want to talk about today with you is how the police specifically targets people of color, why they do that, and how we can fix it. This is not going to be easy. This probably isn't going to be quick. But we can get through it. Wow, that sounds... When they put it like that, it sounds really bad. So, my experience watching racists and people who are not racist debate is that the biggest and most common thing that the fascists and fascist adjacent people get hung up on is definitions. They'll yell at each other and debate each other for days, for weeks about the definitions of certain specific words. So, I'm going to be about as clear as I possibly can in an attempt to avoid that specific pitfall. When I talk about the police, I'm specifically referring to a law enforcement organization, keyword organization, that works under the jurisdiction of a city, state, or the federal government. When I use the word racist or racism, I'm specifically describing actions that result in the disproportionate targeting and negatively affect people of color. Now, to be absolutely crystal clear, what I am not doing is talking about individuals. Not just because parsing out the beliefs and the morality of every individual working for every law enforcement agency that I've described could literally take centuries, but also because I'm not convinced that it's entirely relevant. When you're talking about the structures of an organization and how those structures can disproportionately disadvantage some people, my experience is that talking about individual actors and how they can affect those things tends to be a distraction from talking about the system and how broken it is. And I want to avoid that. I also want to specify here that I am talking about actions and their consequences, not the stated goals of specific organizations. Plenty of police departments make claims of racial equity or even racial equality, but those claims do not line up with the lived reality of most people in this country. I also want to make perfectly clear that the specific claim I am making is that the police are still racist. Not that they used to be racist, but have gotten better, but that they are still explicitly racist on an organizational level. So let's talk about that. So the organizations that we call the police now began in the United States as slave patrols in the South. They would go out, they would capture escaped slaves, and they would bring them back to their racist slaveholders, let's say. That is a historical fact. You can't dispute that in good faith. It is also a historical fact that the police, modern police, explicitly and deliberately upheld explicitly racist laws. That's what the Jim Crow laws were. That's what the Civil Rights Movement was about stopping. There are still people alive who not only had to face oppression from the police due to their race back in the 60s, but there are still people alive who enforced those laws and who will probably tell you, yeah, I did some racist shit in my time as a cop. These are facts. You cannot dispute these things in good faith. Which means that they're not really interesting to talk about. Because the only people you'll find who are willing to talk about those things are people who are acting in bad faith. People who will say that Jim Crow laws weren't really racist, or that slavery was a good thing overall. I'm not interested in talking to those people. I don't think you should be either, so I'm going to very kindly take all of that baggage and put it aside. So instead, we'll start this conversation with 37th President of the United States and friend of the channel, Tricky Dick. I'm not a crook. I'm not a crook. I'm not a crook. I would hope that it is well known enough that Nixon specifically targeted people of color, the nascent Black Power movement, and the anti-war movement for persecution that I don't have to explain the specifics of it. There's an Adam Ruins Everything segment that goes into not only how drug laws are ineffective, but how Richard Nixon specifically empowered law enforcement to go after those groups using strict anti-drug laws, if you want to know more about that. Something we have to bear in mind, too, is that a lot of those laws are still on the books today, which means that there are specifically, deliberately racist laws still being enforced around the country. Like, this is why talking about individual actions is kind of useless in a broader context. Regardless of the intentions of the person who's enforcing those laws, they are literally enforcing a racist law, right? And you can't argue that those laws were or are ineffective. We know the numbers. People of color, and especially black people, are arrested more, are charged with crimes more, and receive disproportionately harsher sentences. And that's even taking into account that black people do more crime overall. These things are facts. You cannot argue them and still be in good faith. You can argue the reason that those facts exist, certainly, and you can argue the effects that those facts have on discourse or on the community that they affect, but you can't argue the extent of those facts. We have racist laws, and they are being used in a racist way. These are not things that you can argue. But none of these things explain exactly how you can have a police force that is effectively persecuting the majority of people in the country. Let's talk about that. So it's been known for a great deal of time that poverty and crime are two sides of the same coin. They are both symptoms of a greater sociological ill. Now, what you call that ill, whether you call it degeneracy or whether you call it capitalism, that's not something I'm interested in talking about in this specific instance because that's a distraction. Let's move on from that. By criminalizing a population, or criminalizing the specific behaviors of a population, you can force that population into a state of perpetual poverty. Pamphleteer, a YouTube user I cannot recommend enough, goes into great depth on this topic in his latest video about information control. You should go watch that. It is much better than whatever crap I'm doing this week. We also need to note that this can and does create a feedback loop, especially when it's behaviors that are being criminalized and not just existing. People who are impoverished are more likely to commit crimes in order to financially support themselves and their family. And because of that, that makes it more likely that they're going to be caught committing crimes, and they're going to be put in jail, and they're going to be convicted as criminals, which makes it more likely that they're going to become more impoverished. Societies all throughout human history have known this and utilized it to their advantage. Hell, here in the US, laws prohibiting the use of marijuana and alcohol were initially meant to create a more hostile environment for incoming immigrants. Again, Tyr goes over that in his video, go watch that. Using crime to demonize communities also serves the practical purpose of breaking apart communities on a micro and a macro level. Not only can you rip one half of a community away from the other half, but you can specifically target, say, charismatic male activists in a community. Or, if you're willing to live knowing you'll go to hell when you die, then you can target children specifically. That seems to be the wager that the Border Patrol and ICE are making. You also can't overlook the material conditions of people, especially people in poverty, being specifically and deliberately made worse by the federal government. Like, back in the 80s, you had the loosening of tax laws and the deregulation of industry, which both led to and necessitated the creation of the prison industrial complex, which led to more people being put in prison, which led to more poverty, which led to more crime. It's also led to the reinstitution of slavery, but that's That's something we'll get into maybe next week? Probably next week. And if you're talking about the deliberate worsening of material conditions, you can't overlook the rhetoric that was used to justify that. You can't overlook Ronald Reagan talking about welfare queens and strapping young bucks. And you can't overlook Hillary Clinton talking about super predators that need to be brought to heel. So I said earlier that law enforcement agencies are specifically targeting people of color for violent harassment and persecution. And maybe pointing out specific acts of police brutality isn't going to be enough to prove that. Maybe pointing out specific government policies that disproportionately seem to target people of color isn't going to be enough to prove that. Maybe pointing out how material conditions have been specifically worsened for people who are in poverty, which are usually people of color, isn't going to be enough to prove that. And maybe talking about the motivations of the people who did those things isn't going to be enough. But taking all of those things in tandem, that sure paints a pretty bleak picture. And there comes a point where you have a preponderance of evidence, and denying that evidence is simply acting in bad faith. Like, I think at this point I've proven my case, so I'm going to move on to how we can fix it. One thing I will say in favor of the police, and this is damning them with faint praise, is that their behavior has gotten a bit better over the last, let's say 5 years. 5 years or so. Now, this hasn't been because all the police officers in the country have gotten together and decided, gee willikers, we sure screwed the pooch. Let's get better. No, it's been because their more egregious acts of police brutality and police misconduct have come to light in very harsh ways. That's why even though the conduct of the police has gotten a little bit better, trust in the police is still really low, especially amongst communities that those people victimized. And while broadcasting those incidents of severe police misconduct and even police violence has been effective in removing people who commit acts of violence from power, to some degree, it has been much more difficult to pin legal consequences onto the people who commit those acts of misconduct and acts of violence. And that's for a number of very specific and very complicated reasons. Most notably, at least in regards to the topic that I've chosen for this month, is that there are people in isolated parts of this country who seem to not only accept this sort of violence, but seem to revel and even delight in this kind of violence. Both the police and people who support the police use the support of those people to justify their violence, at least to some degree, either by saying that they are not as violent as they could have been, or that that kind of violence is necessary to stop people who are more violent than them. And if you find that hard to believe, like, have you seen 24? Have you seen Law and Order? Have you seen Zero Dark 30? Have you seen Chicago PD? A guy puts a knife under a guy's eye. Have you seen Cops? Ever? It's been on for longer than I've been alive. But more and more now, people just aren't buying that. People aren't buying that violence is necessary to keep them safe. Like, all of this is culminated in the United States opening concentration camps on the border for babies, and justifying it, saying that these babies are members of violent gangs, and people not buying that. That's why it's worth asking how we can hold these officers responsible for their actions in a legal context. Not just because of the aforementioned abuse of migrant children, but because that possibility of police violence, of police misconduct, looms large over every interaction the police have with anyone. And observing recent history, we can tell how to do that. See, there are specific people who are specifically protecting the police as an institution, and those people have been democratically elected by the people. If we bring new people into power, as we're starting to do here in Illinois, then the police won't have those same protections. That doesn't mean that it'll work every time, but it will certainly make it much easier to put people to account for doing the terrible things that they do. Skepticism of the police is also at an all-time high. Not just because people of good faith want every person on the border patrol brought before the Hague, but because people, especially white people, have become more aware of the reality of police violence. Some of us have even been the victims of it in small degrees when we oppose the system. And, like, this isn't about white people. This isn't about me. I'm not oppressed. And I'm not just oppressed because I'm a white person. I'm not oppressed because I'm 6 feet and 200 pounds of muscle. Nobody has the temerity to try to oppress me. But people of color are oppressed. And I believe that we have the moral responsibility to make the changes necessary to stop that from happening. What I am saying is that not only do we have the moral responsibility as people to end the oppression of other people, but we have the opportunity right now to actually follow through on that. All we need to do is seize it. Yeah, I think that stands on its own. Not a whole lot to say about this one. Other than, like, I got up at 2 o'clock in the morning to start filming it. This part was filmed at around 5:30 in the morning. I feel more compelled to apologize for not having been around lately, not having put out content in not quite a week, but I missed one of my videos. This was supposed to be up last week, and I missed it. But last week I was very, very busy, and this past week, it's just been so hot. It's been so hot, it has been literally dangerous for me to be down here in the basement. It's been so hot that the roads have been buckling. So, like, I was advised to take this apart and store it somewhere cool, which I did to the best of my ability, or it might get heat damage. So I managed to triumph over the heat, though, which is nice. So just a gentle reminder, I do have a Ko-Fi account. Don't feel obligated to give me money if you don't have money to give, but every little bit does help, and I very much appreciate it. Next week's Saturday video, is going to be about the school-to-prison pipeline, and how that relates to putting children in concentration camps. But before we get to that, I have a friend of the channel, who wants to talk about the Democratic debates. And you're going to have to suffer through it. So, until we get there, take care of yourselves, alright?